This is the Provoked Prawn, and this is a video on the Phanteks Glacier One 240 mph all-in-one cooler. A small but wonderful all-in-one cooler for your CPU, which will allow you to get excellent cooling and a really nice aesthetic out of your case, including this fantastic infinity mirror CPU pump head, which has some really nice RGB lighting on it, that's controllable via RGB software on your motherboard, so it allows for some easy control to match up with your motherboard. You can see it with the ROG Z590 motherboard here. And later on in the video, I'm also going to be demonstrating how to swap out the standard fans that are included with this AIO with case fans, for example, the Lian Li AL120s seen here. So this is an unboxing and installation video. I'm going to be talking to you about the various highlights of the Glacier One. I purchased this mostly because I wanted to see what it would look like in the new build in that Lian Li case, which I've done a video on separately. Also because I was intrigued by not only the pump head, which is a very nice setup in terms of that RGB lighting with the infinity edge mirror display, but also the aesthetic and overall setup in terms of the fans, because included in the case, you will find that it doesn't come with RGB fans, but instead has some mounting devices that go over the top that shine RGB onto them. It's also daisy chainable, which I'm going to demonstrate as we go through, which makes it interesting to set up. And it looks complicated to begin with, but actually once you get into the process of it, it becomes fairly straightforward and reasonably easy to manage, although the cable management can be a bit tricky. It's also a very nice looking cooler that runs nice and quiet and does the business. It's mountable obviously with Intel and AMD sockets, and I'll leave information in the description on what it's compatible with. It will work with Intel's LGA 1700 as well, with an appropriate adapter, so it's possible to do that. In this build though, I'm using an 11th gen Intel setup with LGA 1200 socket, and the necessary equipment is included in the package for that. It's also worth noting obviously that it comes with AMD brackets as well, so you can change those out, but I won't be demonstrating that here. Unfortunately, I don't have an AMD setup to be able to show you. Now, as I said, included in the box, you get some PWM controllable fans, but these are not RGB as standard. You'll see it just has one cable coming out of it. So you actually have the option to either use RGB or not, depending on your preference, which is pretty cool. So these are 120mm fans. Obviously, this AIO is also available in other sizes. You can get a 280 version, which uses two 140mm fans, or a 360, which has three 120mm. So these are the Halo fan frames that go over the top, and these offer the RGB lighting that you saw earlier on. They come with two cables on them, and that's because they're daisy chainable. So what works is basically this sits over the top of the fan, and then you screw through the frame and into the fan and then into the radiator to hold it all in place. And then you just connect up the cables, and that's how you get your RGB lighting. But if you don't want the RGB, you just don't have to install those frames, which is pretty interesting. Also, you will note that the top bit, the infinity mirror display, is separated from the pump itself. And again, there's some cables there. Now, obviously, that thing also requires RGB connection, and that is part of the daisy chain setup as well. So you connect all these things together and then connect it up to your motherboard, as I'll show you later on, and then that allows for control of the RGB from your motherboard software. So in the case I'm using here, that will obviously be Armory Crate from Zeus. In the box, you also get a number of different cables, and I'll go into those. And I think the cables might be a bit intimidating if this is your first all-in-one setup. It is quite a mess of cables to deal with, and initially it looks quite scary, but I will say actually the manual that you saw is fairly straightforward, and hopefully by the end of this video you'll feel pretty confident about it anyway, because it isn't as bad as it looks. It has the Intel bracket pre-installed and also thermal paste pre-installed, so obviously as an all-in-one solution is very convenient. You don't need to fill it up with liquid. You don't need to worry about a thermal paste or anything else. It's just a case of installing it and off you go. You're ready to get going with your PC setup. The process here is obviously going to be working out the orientation of this all-in-one pump and the radiator in the case and the best way to set it up. As I showed at the beginning of this video, I'm using side mounted, but you obviously could go for front or top mounting and setting it up so that you have the best cooling for you and for your setup. I'll talk a bit more about that later on. Inside the cable bag, you'll find a number of different cables, including an RGB connection cable. This can be used to both connect the RGB cables to your motherboard or to a separate controller. So if you have an RGB fan controller, you can use that. There's also a Y splitter cable, which basically takes two power cables for fan power control and allows you to connect that up to your motherboard. A bit about that later on, a bit extra. And an extension lead, so you can use that to extend that power reach as well. Again, all of this is daisy chainable, so you can set it up so everything's connected nice and easily, which makes things a lot more straightforward, and there's no need to worry about fan controllers or extra controls. In there, you'll also see the back plates for the Intel setup, as well as the brackets for the AMD mounting, should you need it. You'll also find some long fan screws included, and the standoffs and thumb screws for the mounting of the pump head, and AM4 mountings for the AMD setup, as well as some clips for the pump tubes, which I didn't actually use, but I probably should have done. And those basically hold the tubes in place to make them look a bit neater. And here you can see the complete package and what it looks like. Now, it's worth noting that there are two different sizes of these screws. There's ones that are slightly longer. They have a slightly longer thread to them, and those are the ones that I'm going to be using in this mounting, because basically you have two different sizes depending on whether you're going to be using the Halo RGB attachments on your fans or not. And the longer ones obviously go through both of those, whereas the slightly shorter ones will only go through the fans and into the radiator. So the setup process, as I said, is to establish how we're going to mount the radiator on the case, where the pump is going to be in relation to that, and then where the fans are going to mount. So I've already established that I want it on the side rear of the case. So what I'm going to do is mount the fans in a way that the cables are going to be pointing towards the back of the case so that I can get them out of the way and make things nice and tidy. I'm also mounting the fans so that they face in towards the case. What this does is it will suck air from the inside the case over the radiator and out the rear. What you will notice is later on that I'll be using the AL120s from Lian Li in the opposite direction, and I'll talk a bit more about why later on. But you could choose to mount them in either direction and they'll still fit. And then obviously if you want to have the RGB lighting, which I say is actually very good from what you saw at the beginning clips, that you obviously then install the Halo fan frames over the top. And then we're using those long screws to go through. Now obviously make sure all the cables are on the left hand side, as you can see that I've done here, and then go about the process of installing 8 screws into it to hold the fans into the radiator. It's much easier to do this now than it is later on when everything's already in the case, so it makes things a lot more straightforward. Now when you tip it on its side, you'll see that you have the two different sorts of cables here. We have those thick black power cables, and then the black and grey RGB cables. So the power cables can be daisy chained together. So you're connecting those two together. That means that once you connect the power up, both those fans are going to get the power they need to. The bonus of this also, as I'll show in a minute, is that the next bit of that can then run to the pump head, so that you can connect it up to the pump so that all three things can be powered. Alternatively, you have cables that will allow you to connect the fans directly to your motherboard as well. So you can use the extension cable, as I have done here, to get that extra length that you might need. This is good for cable tidying, also ensuring that you have cables in the right place in the case and that it's set up so it can reach what you want it to. And then you can use the Y splitter. So in my setup, what I did is I've used this cable, plugged into the Y splitter with one part, plugged the pump head into the other bit of the Y splitter, and then connect up the main part of this to the CPU fan header on the motherboard, which I'll show later on. The alternative is you plug in both fans, daisy chain them together, then you connect them to the CPU fan additional header, and then the pump head goes to the CPU fan header, and you can split it that way. It's a personal choice, but it works perfectly well with the Y splitter from my experience, and that allows your motherboard to control the speed of everything and to make sure that the power is running as it should. But you can see how that process would look here. So I've got the Y splitter connected to both the pump head and to the fans in that daisy chain connection, and then that just goes to the CPU fan header on the motherboard, which again I'll show you a bit later on, but it's usually in the top right corner of the motherboard. Now we get onto the RGB lighting from the Halo fan frames, and again this is daisy chainable, so one connection simply connects to the other. You see quite a lot of cabling here, Also, there are connectors on both ends of it, so you can potentially, if you had more Phanteks RGB fans in your case, you could obviously daisy chain those up together as well. The pump head has this cover on with the infinity mirror display on it. Obviously that needs RGB lighting as well. So because of the daisy chain effect of that, you can obviously undo all these cables and then you can connect that up there too. So then you have RGB sorted, and you also have the power sorted for the fan and the pump, and everything's nice and neat. So actually what looks quite intimidating to start with isn't too bad. What you will notice though is there's quite a lot of cables there, and once they're all undone, they also become quite unwieldy. However, depending on your case, you might be able to hide some of that away at the back of the case. I certainly managed to do in the Lian Li cases. I'll show you as we go through. You then have the RGB connector, which connects up to the motherboard, so you can connect that to another part of that daisy chain setup, either from the pump head or from the bottom of the fan daisy chain connections. You connect that up and then you connect that to the RGB header on your motherboard. You'll usually find there's an RGB header with 3 pins in it, or as I said, you have the male adapter, which will actually connect up to an RGB controller if you happen to have one. So there are options in how you install this and how you set it up, whether you're going to use the RGB or not on the fans, or whether you're just going for a slick fan setup and then the pump head has the RGB. The next stage of the process for this LGA 1200 socket is obviously to install the backplate on the motherboard, making sure that sticks through and you've got those bits lined up with the holes on the rear of the motherboard, and then we feed it through to the front, and then we're using these standoff screws that I'll show you in a second to hold it down. I haven't got the motherboard installed at the moment, but obviously you can do this if it's already in the case, if you're upgrading. And if you're looking to switch out, it is a little bit easier this way because you don't need to hold things in place. Now, in the little bag that holds the thumb screws and the standoff screws, you'll find 2 different variants of standoff screws, a slightly different size. You'll note that one has the same length on both ends and the other one has slightly shorter. We want, for this setup, one with the same length on both ends. You just need to then screw those into the 4 points. That then holds the backplate in place and prepares the CPU area for the mounting of the pump head. The convenience here obviously is that the pump itself already has thermal paste pre-applied, which is excellent. What you will have noticed if you're paying attention earlier on in the video as well is that this all-in-one cooler actually comes with an extra tube of thermal paste, which is interesting, but don't be confused, you don't need to use that. It is for future builds, so if, for example, you decide to upgrade, take the pump off, you can then clean up the CPU and the pump and then replace the thermal paste and use it again. So you might use it in a different case or with a different motherboard or with a different CPU. So it's really nice they've included that as standard, although some might find it confusing as to why it's there in the first place. Don't worry, you can just use the pre-applied thermal paste and get on just fine with that. And it also is beneficial because it means you don't need to worry about how much to apply or whether you put too much or too little on, which is obviously a worry for many new builders. So what I'm doing is seating the all-in-one cooler on the side of the case. And the reason for this is that I believe that it gives excellent airflow there, and it means that I can benefit from either exhausting or intaking air. Now in this case, the front fans pull air into the case, and then I'm going to be exhausting out the top. I also have intake fans at the bottom, as you will have seen at the beginning of this video. In this setup, I'm exhausting air out over the radiator. So cold air, hopefully, will be going out over the radiator to cool down the temperature of the liquid inside and then help the CPU stay cool. I actually think, personally, that the other way around is slightly better, and that's what I did with the SL120s. However, I am showing you your options because there's arguments for both. You can use either way, really. It really depends on your case setup as well. This case has quite a lot of fans that will be pulling cold air into it, so that should ensure that it keeps cold. Now, one little problem that you'll see here, this is actually a side note related to the case and the setup and consideration of it, is that there's a side-mounted front panel USB connection here, which I now can't plug in because of the mounting of this radiator. So something to think about when you're going through an installation like this. The next stage of the process is obviously to mount the radiator to the case. You'll find the tiny little screws and washers included in the box with the cooler, and they basically just screw into the holes at the rear to hold it in place. What you will notice, as well as a gap in the top and the bottom of the rad here and the way that's set up, So it's personal preference as to where you adjust that. Once all that's done, it's then just a case of seating the pump head over the standoffs and then screwing the thumb screws down gently, not over tightening them, and do each corner individually, moving from corner to corner and being very gentle with the installation so it's not too tight and you have equal pressure across the entirety of the thing. What you will see on the right hand side now, as I have a mess of cables to deal with that are coming out of the fan, the pump head and everything else, so it still looks quite messy and a bit intimidating, but by the time you've finished, it's much tidier and it's a lot more straightforward than it looks as well, which is pretty joyful. Also really like the daisy chain nature of it. It makes things a lot easier. A lot of other setups require 2 cables from each fan that you then have to deal with a control box and other things. It just becomes complicated. So again, the pump head has that power connection that comes out of it. You could connect that straight to the CPU fan header on your motherboard. As I said, what I have done is use the Y splitter to connect both the fans and the pump head directly to the CPU fan header on the motherboard here. Next to that, I have an optional extra CPU fan header, so there's 2 essentially. So you could use one for the pump head and one for the fans. This is going to vary depending on your motherboard. You might find that you only have one, in which case use the Y splitter. That's the best way of doing it. Now, the RGB fan connections, as I said again, daisy chained from the fans and then daisy chained up to the pump head, so that allows me to easily connect all those up to ensure the RGB is just daisy chained up nicely and then can easily obviously be connected to the motherboard, and then that will give you the control that you need. This is held in place with magnets, so it's fairly straightforward to just clip it on. You need to make sure that the cabling is out of the way and it isn't causing a problem so you can get it on straight. Now, I've fed the majority of what I can of the cables to the back of the case, because otherwise you have a big mess of cables at the front. And again, I'm connecting the RGB connections from the pump head to the fans to make sure they're all connected up and everything's daisy chained nicely together. This ensures that we can then use that single RGB cable connection, which on one end connects to your loop of daisy chain cables and the other end connects up to the motherboard. Because this AIO doesn't have a USB connection or any sort of fan controller, all the RGB lighting is controlled from your motherboard software rather than from Phanteks' own software, for example, which is fairly unusual actually from other all-in-one coolers I've seen. Usually you have software from that manufacturer that then used to control it with the option of controlling it from the motherboard software, but here it's controlled directly from the motherboard software and you plug it into the RGB head on your motherboard. In this case, on this motherboard, it's in the top right. Once that's done and the machine's powered on, don't forget to peel off the plastic peel on top of the Infinity mirror design, and you can then obviously enjoy the glory of that RGB lighting. Jump into your Windows install and find the RGB controls on your motherboard software, and you can then adjust the RGB lighting here. What you're seeing is some very nice visuals. Again, a point of note, don't forget those plastic clips included in the case. I didn't use those, but they attach to the pump that comes from the radiator to the pump head. You can use those to separate the cables and keep things nice and neat. I didn't do that here, but you can do, and it's fairly straightforward to do. They're just a few clips that clip on. So here you can see what that overall finish looks like, and actually those fans look very nice with that RGB halo glowing onto them. It's an unusual design to have standard fans which have an outer frame that then does the RGB rather than the RGB coming from the fans themselves or rings around the fans, so it's quite nice. And actually the setup's really good, but what I wanted to do is to show you how it's possible to use different fans with the Radiator as well, so that's another option. So you can see it here with Lian Li's AL120 fans. So during the installation of this, as I showed earlier on, it caused me a bit of a problems with the Radiator being mounted at the front. The fan height and the overall width of the thing meant that it was impossible for me to plug in my front panel USB connection for the motherboard, which is obviously not ideal. So the joys of this case, which I've done a video on separately if you're curious and want to know more about it, is that there's a dual chamber layout, so there's plenty of room at the back so you can maneuver something like a 240mm radiator into the back of the case, which then frees up extra space at the front and still get good cooling. In this instance, I'm then going to be using Lian Li's AL120 fans so that they match with the rest of the case. Now, this isn't a problem because I'm still obviously going to be cooling the radiator and blowing air over it. But in this instance, as I said, I'm actually installing them the other way. So installing through the case using long screws again. Long screws go through the fans, through the case and into the radiator, and it holds everything in place. The setup that I'm using here is essentially intaking air from the rear. So I'm pulling in cold air over the radiator and then cooling down that CPU liquid again to make sure everything's running cool. You have the option to do it in either direction, but the reason I've done this is because I have intake fans at the front. If I was immediately exhausting through the side, obviously I'm then pulling air in through the front of the case with these front fans and then immediately taking it back out again through the side. So my view is that it's better to pull cold air in through the front and side and then exhaust the hot air out the top. This should result in a cool CPU performance. Whatever is best, you'll probably argue with plenty of people on the internet about it. Anyway, once those fans are installed, the connection is then to use Lian Li's control box to plug in the RGB lighting for all the fans in the case and the power. But the difference here is normally you'd plug the AL120s into this control box. Both the RGB and the power are done separately with two different connections. But in this instance, actually what I'm doing is slightly different because I am connecting up the power from the two fans that are on the radiator, and I'm connecting those directly to the CPU optional header on the motherboard. So where, as earlier on I was suggesting about the cables coming from the pump head and from the fans going into a Y splitter and then connecting to the motherboard CPU fan header, here I'm plugging in the power for the majority of the fans in the case into the controller, but then for those two fans that are on the radiator, I'm going to plug those into the optional extra CPU fan header on the motherboard. So that gives the motherboard control of both the pump head and the fans on the radiator to ensure that the fans and the pump are working in a way that will cool the CPU down as much as possible, and it ensures uniform cooling. But because the RGB lighting is plugged into the Lian Li control box, that means that you can still control the RGB lighting via Lian Li's L-Connect software, and also additionally, because that control box also plugs into the RGB fan header on your motherboard, you can control the RGB lighting through there. So that control box plugs into the USB connection, a system fan header to give you PWM control, the RGB header on your motherboard, and also SATA power on the power supply unit as well. So similar connections to what the Phanteks fans do in terms of the setup, except obviously the addition of the SATA power connection, because connecting up multiple fans in here, obviously we end up with a lot more fans than we did before. And then obviously then going about the tidying process to make sure that everything's nice and neat at the back of the case. Now, obviously I've demonstrated this with Lian Li's fans, but you could do this same logic with any other case fans that you're using, whether it's Corsairs, for example, QL120s or LL120s or NZXT, whatever you're doing, whatever case you're building in, you can apply this similar logic to connect the fans directly to your motherboard while still also connecting them up to the radiator to ensure excellent cooling. Obviously you want to get static pressure fans where you can, so they give you excellent airflow through the radiator and the best possible performance. And obviously Phanteks would prefer if you use their fans, and I must say the RGB covers on the fans lead to some really good RGB lighting, and an option will be to just install Phanteks fans in this Lian Li case instead. But if you're heart set on a particular fan setup and you want to ensure that the fans are uniform across the case, it is possible to still use an awesome looking radiator with a good cooling capabilities, but the dedicated fans for that particular case or for your build. So it is an option. It's something I wanted to demonstrate in this video, and hopefully it's been useful. This has been the Provoked Prawn. I hope you found this video useful and interesting. Be sure to check out the video on the Lian Li Air Mini because it's a fantastic case with some really great highlights. And let me know in the comments if you've got any questions. Thanks for watching. Have a fantastic life. You deserve it. This has been the Provoked Prawn. Hope you found this video useful, interesting, hilarious, or otherwise. Take a look at these other videos that I think you might find interesting as well. And have a look at the description for links and other information you might find useful. Click that join button to see the benefits of being a member of my YouTube channel. And most importantly, have a great life.